session title is Financial Regulation. We have two distinguished presentations and two discussors. First presentation will be made by Professor Schmulow from Melbourne Law School in Australia. He has a specialty in twin peak system, which may be introduced in some years in Korea as well. Twin peak system is originated from Australia around 15 years ago, which was followed by the Holland, the Netherlands, and then UK. Recently, France and even China are considering the adaptation of the twin peak regulatory system, so which is going to be very, very interesting for our and important for Korea as well. And the second paper will be presented by Professor Kerton from University of Waterloo, which is well known for its insurance and actuarial education insurance area in Korea. Also, Professor Kerton has devoted his whole life for research and teaching and also social activities, mostly for the consumer activities, including Consumers International and the Consumers Canada. So he is going to make a presentation over the financial literacy and the market conduct regulation. After these two presentations, we will have two discussants. First discussant is Professor JUNG. I think he's the most famous professor in this room. The Korean newspaper cites his name every week. And he got his PhD from MIT, and he teaches and does research in financial services, regulation, and system design. And he's very, very busy. So he spared his time for all of us to make a comment for this paper. And the second discussant is Mr. Barrett from ING Korea. He is originally from UK and serving for the several insurance companies in UK and Poland. He came to Korea around 5 years ago to work for the ING Life. So he had experience for the two countries I already mentioned, Poland and UK, and he is very suitable expert in twin peak regulation. He is the chief actuary of ING Life and very frequent speaker in Korean Actuarial Society as well. So he also sacrificed part of his Sunday to make a comment for this presentation. But we are already 25 minutes behind our schedule. We need to reduce part of the speed. So I'm going to ask two presenters for 25 minutes for presentation and 10 minutes for each discussion. Please welcome Professor Schmulow from Australia.
Good morning, colleagues. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge our hosts, Professor JUNG and Professor Shin. Thank you for your hospitality and thank you for organising this conference. So I'm going to be speaking to you today about consumer protection and financial system stability under Australia's Twin Peaks model of financial system regulation. And I'm going to start off with the conclusion so that you know where this is going to go. Australia uses the Twin Peaks system. It's one of four types of systems that are currently in use in the world, and it is by every measure the best system. However, it's not perfect, nor is it an effective guarantee of either consumer protection or system stability. So why bother studying it? Well, It does work better than the others and has fewer failures and fewer theoretical weaknesses than the others. And so that's one reason to study it. But it is a system that has failed in the Netherlands, and it has suffered critical points of failure in Australia, especially as regards the financial advice scandals affecting consumers in Australian banks. So the point of my talk is to tell you about Twin Peaks, but to do so honestly and with integrity, and to tell you about where it is strong and where it is weak and where it can be improved. Put simply, yes indeed, please do copy Australia, but please don't make the mistakes we've made. As Coffey and Sale point out, the Twin Peaks model has now been held up as the most effective model to address the flaws in unregulated or thinly regulated markets where the most problematic issues arose in the GFC. It is a system that has been put forward and recommended by the World Bank, the G20, the OECD, and the International Monetary Fund. As Erskine states, it is as a regulatory structure, it is the envy of many other countries, and more recent regulatory architectural reforms in other countries are often based on what is described as the Australian Twin Peaks approach. So what is Twin Peaks? Well, it's not the David Lynch mini-series. Although I must tell you, funnily enough, the gentleman who devised Twin Peaks, Dr. Michael Taylor, said to me in a conversation that I had with him some time ago, that when he devised the Twin Peaks model, he had actually at the time been watching David Lynch's miniseries, and partly tongue-in-cheek, he referred to it as the Twin Peaks model. It is in fact not a Twin Peak model, it is in fact a Triple Peak model, and I'll come to that. Despite being proposed by an Englishman, it was first adopted in Australia in 1997. It envisages two peak regulators, one to guarantee financial system stability, the other to guarantee good market conduct and consumer protection. So Australia has therefore used Twin Peaks longer than any other country, and we have recently subjected the model to a rigorous 14-year review called the Financial System Inquiry. So what forms does Twin Peaks take in Australia? In terms of guaranteeing financial system stability, that is managed by APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, and in terms of good market conduct and consumer protection, that is managed by ASIC, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. What are the advantages of Twin Peaks? Well, regulators are more effective, with each having a clear remit that do not overlap. They can, as a result, be more accountable and more focused on achieving their outcomes. It creates checks and balances between agencies and their objectives. It allows each regulator to create its own culture that best suits its objectives, and it allows each regulator to acquire expertise specifically required to meet its objectives. Fundamentally, Twin Peaks rests upon a risk-based paradigm. So in other words, regulators are not charged with combating all forms of risk to the system. They are asked primarily to prioritise risks, to pick important problems and then fix them. But there are problems with a risk-based paradigm. Firstly, the assumption that regulators are smart enough to foresee the unforeseeable. Put differently, there is an assumption that regulators will know where the next financial crisis is coming from, and that they will consequently act to forestall it. But as we saw during the global financial crisis, these assumptions are not always correct. As Julia Black states, indeed, with respect to the global financial crisis more broadly, assumptions that had been made as to how markets would react in particular scenarios proved significantly misplaced. With risk events that had been anticipated to occur once in several lives of the universe occurring every day. The model itself, the risk-based paradigm model, may incorrectly prioritise which risks to avoid, as distinct from a failure to identify the risks at all. And this was evident in the failure of the Australian insurer HIH, which was at the time the largest corporate collapse in Australian history. There exists also a risk of process-induced myopia. In other words, a focus on the process instead of on the outcome. And this is something that is particularly prevalent in and amongst government bureaucracies. As Black states again, if little scope is given in practice for those engaged in working within the framework to work outside of the framework where they see the need, the framework will always be prey to events that those working within it were not given the room to say they had seen. Anecdotal evidence suggests that criticism of APRA, the bank regulator, and challenges to the organisation's prevailing orthodoxies are in danger of being met with hostility. And that was certainly my experience when I worked for APRA. There is a lack of predictive certainty for the regulatees as to what form of conduct will be sanctioned and what form will not be sanctioned in a risk-based paradigm. And that in turn encourages a capricious regulatory environment, particularly where different individuals in the regulators take different approaches or have different priorities. And those approaches change and those priorities change over time. An unpredictable regulatory environment brought about by changes in the prevailing political climate. The potential for regulators to encourage regulatory forbearance by either arguing that proposed sanctions pose a greater risk to the regulated entity and therefore the entire financial system, or that the sanctions pose a greater risk to the financial system than the misconduct itself. The potential for regulators to encourage forbearance by arguing that similar conduct was expressly authorised in the past. What Llewellyn refers to as the Christmas tree effect, in which the regulators' remit steadily increases as perceptions of risk increases, with a wide array of ancillary functions both to the point of overburden and to the point of distraction from what should be core activities. And perceptions of risk are exactly that, they're perceptions. While APRA has attempted to create a methodology around the assessment of risk and to lessen the impact upon the assessment of risk of individuals' perceptions, risk assessment is not and will never be as, Julia Barrett said, rational or as consistent in substance as its form suggests. So, a risk-based paradigm which forms part of an even greater overarching paradigm known as a principles-based paradigm has attracted the following criticism from Hector Sanz. A principles-based approach does not work with individuals who have no principles. And where have we seen that more evident than in the banking sector? There are behavioural economists, and there are some amongst us today who are of the view that the banking sector has a particular propensity to attract workplace psychopaths. Now, I want to move on to a particular failure of the Australian Twin Peaks model, its failure to protect consumers. But before I do that, I want to point out two things. Yes, Australia did exceptionally well during the global financial crisis, but how much of that was as a result of Twin Peaks? And how much of it was as a result of a runaway mining boom, a banking sector that was not exposed to exotic and foreign derivatives, and a government that engaged in a massive infrastructure spending program in order to buoy the Australian economy through the global financial crisis. And secondly, before the global financial crisis, Twin Peaks was in use in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands did exceptionally badly. 85% of their banks had to be recapitalised. So Twin Peaks is not the solution to all our problems. And in Australia, there have been particular failures in respect of consumer protection. And those relate to the financial advice scandals. Now, For many people at this conference, consumer protection is important in its own right. I come to this problem from the perspective of someone who's interested in system stability. That is my primary concern. Nonetheless, let me point out to you, the global financial crisis began as the subprime disaster. The subprime disaster was a consumer abuse and a market misconduct exercise writ large. Who can forget the no-doc and the low-doc and the liner loans? What is a no-doc loan? Prove that you're a carbon-based life form with a pulse and they'll give you money. How is that know your customer? And the subprime disaster then metastasized into the global financial crisis and became a firestorm that swept the globe. So don't underestimate consumer protection in terms of financial system stability. So that's the first thing I want to say. Consumer protection is important, not just for the protection of consumers, but also for the protection of the financial system as a whole. The financial advice scandals in Australia are an absolute disgrace. ASIC, the Securities and Investments Commission, constituted a disgraceful point of failure. And the Australian Senate has excoriated ASIC in a 600-page report, of which 594 pages is extremely critical of what ASIC did or did not do. And the reasons why ASIC conducted itself in the way it did is because it has a very close, and I would suggest too close, relationship with the banks that it supervises. There seems to be a cross-pollination. People who are in senior positions in banks and used to be in senior positions at ASIC. People in senior positions in ASIC and who used to be in senior positions in the bank. So they're BFFs, best friends forever. And it took 18 months before ASIC got off its backside and started to tackle the financial advice scandal. 18 months in which whistleblower after whistleblower had presented documentary evidence to ASIC, not just of misleading and deceptive conduct that had been engaged in by banks, but in fact also of outright document fraud. And there are, if I was to reduce the reason why ASIC eventually got off its backside and did something about the financial advice scandal, I would reduce that reason to 2 words. Adele Ferguson. She's a journalist at The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. She's probably one of the best journalists in Australia. She wrote a number of exposés of what had happened with the financial advice departments at Commonwealth Bank and National Australia Bank that were published in a series of articles in The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, and that created a firestorm around ASIC. And all of a sudden, ASIC went from saying, oh, well, we don't have the resources, and we don't have the time, and it's too difficult, and it's too hard, to going, yep, okay, we'll do something about this. So that says to me, if initially the regulator says, we don't have the time, we don't have the resources, it's too hard, it makes my head hurt, and then they get put under a lot of public pressure, and the Australian Senate excoriates them, and all of a sudden their head doesn't hurt so much and they can do the job. Well, what does that say about their initial reasons? Was it that their head hurts and they don't have enough resources, or is it they're lazy and incompetent? So what is the solution to weak enforcement? And the solution to weak enforcement, I think, comes from a jurisdiction that doesn't use twin peaks, and that's the Monetary Authority of Singapore. The Singaporeans have transcended the limitations of compliance and the heretofore dominance of risk management systems designed in terms of minimising the risk to the institution. Instead, it has very consciously aligned the end, market integrity, for that you can read consumer protection, with the purpose of risk management, protecting the public interest. Firms are assessed on their demonstrable capacity to protect the public interest. This very clear exercise in regulatory engineering, combined with demand to report suspicion rather than evidence of wrongdoing. Singaporean banks have to report suspicion of wrongdoing, long before there is evidence of wrongdoing. Combined with the demand to report suspicion rather than evidence of wrongdoing and a power of compulsion, creates a panopticon effect. It may also lead to warranted confidence in banking industry exhortations that they are committed to professional integrity. It is a framework that is deserving of attention and emulation. That was Justin O'Brien. One senior banker in Singapore stated, "The inspections and reprimands from the Monetary Authority of Singapore are everything." A European banking veteran said, "Not respecting the rules risks huge fines and even prison." In respect of circumventing ASIC's continual complaints about lack of resources and lack of legal powers, I want to put forward an idea at this conference today, and that is to incentivise compliance. Incentivise compliance enforcement, I should say. Put ASIC in a regime where it is allowed to keep a certain percentage of whatever fines it levies, and see if that encourages ASIC to levy more fines and to punish more wrongdoing. In conclusion, let me say to you that even from my perspective, which is the perspective of system stability, consumer protection matters. It matters because it was the progenitor for the global financial crisis. In respect of Twin Peaks is great, but it's not perfect. Culture of the regulators, capacity to prevent regulatory capture and providing incentives are all very important. And in that regard, you need to ask yourself, what kind of regulator do you want? Do you want a poodle or do you want a hell dog? Put simply, don't take your eyes off the priorities. Protecting the financial system at a macro level must include protecting the financial system at a micro level. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Schmulow. He saved lots of time, so we can have only lunch for everyone. I think that we had better invite the next speaker before the discussion. So let me introduce the second speaker from Canada, Professor Barrett, who is going to deliver a speech about the financial literacy and the market conduct regulation. Please give him a big hand.
Thank you very much. I would like to extend my thanks to the organizers of the whole institution, because there was a missing institution that didn't allow the sharing of consumer-type research in the world, and this is a big solution that will make a lot of progress with that. Let me begin with the fact that a new book that's probably been out only 4 weeks gives us a lot of support. My feeling is that quite a bit of consumer research in the last several decades has been effective only among the consumer researchers and hasn't really reached the broader audience. And I can certainly say that in economics, that that's the case. See if this, maybe I need to do something. I'm excited with pushing the button. Oops, I went twice. Okay, this is where it might be. The new book is by Egerloff and Schiller, and each of these has won the Nobel Prize in Economics, so they're a pretty good friend to have on our side of this discussion. And in the new book, it's called Fishing for Fools, Economics of Manipulation and Deception. Fishing, you probably realize, is mostly an online term for fishing for people, spelled that way. And fools, they spell fools with a PH just to make it symmetrical with fishing. So it means pretty well what it says, fishing for fools, looking for people you can fool in the financial services sector. And so in that book, I really thought I was going to come up with the quotation. No, seemed to be missing a slide. Okay, biased set of information so that they would then make erroneous judgments. Psychological fools based on the behavioral characteristics that have become important lately. And their argument is that these information difficulties and fishing for fools is a very successful, but very ordinary economic phenomenon. So their argument has, first of all, a concession that free markets have great merit, but they're not opposed to free markets in the least. In fact, probably interesting to people in this room that they, in their praise for free markets, they mention a little scan going from North Korea to South Korea as a way for seeing the difference that free markets have made. But they point out that mainstream economics did a very poor job of discussing in advance the probability that there would be a collapse. Now, there are a few people who predict collapse every year. Of course, they turn out to once in a while to be right. But Schiller is one of the few people who actually collected the data and was able to see that there's a big bubble. And so Akerlof and Schiller argue that people's naivety and susceptibility to deception have been swept under the rug in economics. This, they argue, has seriously hampered financial analysis. They say that in 2.5 million articles in the books in finance and economics, there should have been plenty of economists giving advance warnings about the crisis prior to 2008. Very few showed any concern. So they argue that this missing, the fact that this analysis and prediction was missing, is a defect in economics, and that we can improve economics by recognizing that the same incentives that give us all the benefits of markets and payouts and so on also provide people who want to deceive you with incentives to invent those kinds of things. Now, I'm claiming to be one of the persons who wasn't fooled by this, because in 1995, in the Journal of Consumer Affairs, I published an article on this same topic, which was the marketing of lemons, quality choice, and the economics of concealment. Now, in the argument I made with my co-author, we're mostly pointing out that it's possible to buy some inputs that conceal the defect in the product. And one of the losers there is the firm that's doing a good job and they're selling great products, but the customer can't tell that that product is great because the concealment has been successful. And probably the easiest example I can give you is not from finance, but if you remember the scandal over the marketing of breast milk substitutes, the world's biggest company used to dress salespeople as nurses and put them in hospitals, and mostly in Asia and Africa. And so the person who's just had a baby sees somebody they think is a nurse. And my point is that the nurse's costume, the dress, is concealment. That's, the price of the input that the seller has to spend in order to get the deceptive market that breast milk substitute is better than breast milk. So if you remember that scandal, that's the kind of example. There are other examples too where you could be buying ratings that are defective. One of the great examples was a company called Industrial Biotest that pharmaceutical companies could use to buy deceptive tests. And once it became known, the company went bankrupt. But in the meantime, some of the products were put on the market that shouldn't be there. And the problem still continues, but it's much less severe now. So the part of the argument that I want to make is that we have got a pretty rapid rate of change with all of the products going into the market. And that's a bit of a challenge for consumers. And you've got hedge funds, private equity, weather and derivatives, exchange-traded funds, multifamily offices, Islamic bonds, retail structured products, shadow banking. The shadow banking system has generated a whole lot of innovations as well. And the question is, are all these innovations good? And the answer is, well, most of them turn out to be things that improve our standard of living. But some of them are almost always fishing for fools because they're products that don't work. So there are plenty of products that are difficulties. So what's the problem with financial literacy? I'm trying to say that just looking at financial literacy alone is not the right path to go. And the difficulty of a decision that a consumer faces, D, is actually a ratio. And this is the simplest way I can express it. It should be more complicated than this. But the difficulty depends not only on the resources you have available to you, your literacy, your skills and capability and your experience. That's the L, financial literacy. But it also depends on the technical complexity of the products that are coming out. Now, the technical complexity matters quite a lot because we've had examinations of new product introductions in the financial services sector. And there are lots and lots of products on there that even professionals haven't assessed very well. And mortgage-backed securities is really the easiest example to make, that people accepted the ratings and traded them, and countries and so on bought them as well. And in the consumer literature, consumer research literature, you can go all the way back to 1912, when Wesley Carter Mitchell, who was president of the American Economic Association, pointed out that the problem is that the complexity, here's the quote from his paper: "To spend money is easy, to spend it well is hard. Our faults as spenders are not wholly due to wantonness, just being careless, but largely due to broad conditions over we as individuals have slight control." There are conditions that we don't have control over. And so he's pointing out that in 1912, there were too many new products coming on the market. It was really hard to understand them all, you know, try to deal with it. And the consumers were not making good choices in that time. And of course, that's a problem that's come up later. Now, I'm not really opposed to the efforts that are being made to improve value. And I published a paper as long ago as 1980 on consumer search capital. And the point of it was to say that the consumer has to have the resources necessary. It could be financial literacy, but it also can be experience. If you're buying something the first time, you're at risk. If you bought it 7 times, you've got some experience that you can call on. And so there are a number of factors that give you control, and most of them are in the general area of financial literacy. I would argue that if you really want to go to make progress, the idea to look at is control, financial control. This is Wesley Carter Mitchell's idea that you want to have control over your decision making. And how do you get that? And of course, people who are doing the research on the financial literacy are making some progress on that. Sharon is editor of the Journal of Consumer Affairs, and one of the recent editions has a selection of articles that are right on financial literacy. And the interesting thing about it is that they're available free, which is rare experience. So what's the core problem then? The core problem is that a lot of the people who are motivated to work on this don't realize that sometimes you can just have a little information box, a requirement, you know, a conduct requirement that you've got to put on your, let's say it's a, I don't know, credit card application. You must put on the application, you say, in this box, most of you have seen this kind of thing, the interest rate that includes all the other charges, so the total cost is visible. And that can do way more to give consumer control than all the literacy in the world, because this variable changes rather slowly, the L. And there are a lot of conduct things about deception and so on, where you can pass a law, or most of you know the information about reverse onus, and that if you put a proposal to a person that they can sign up for a pension deduction from their pay when they start a job, and the condition starts off that they're not in, then, you know, a small number, my paper gave you the number from the original studies, but some small number like 10 or 15% of people will take the trouble to sign up. But if you make it reverse the onus, most people here know that the results change to up to 80%. Most people leave it alone that they're signed up. So that is a kind of a way of making progress that seems to be superior to trying to work on the literacy. All right, so the problem is that the T changes quickly. How does it change So why does it change so quickly? Well, the new product innovation is one problem. And if we had a way to separate the way you do new drug introductions, where if the product doesn't work for the purpose it's claimed, scientifically not possible, then you can't introduce it. That would be probably unlikely to happen in the financial services sector. But if it doesn't happen, then you've got a complexity problem with tea, because you're going to have innovations that I would like to call synovations. The synovations are the products that don't work, or just confuse customers because they don't work. Well, information overload is one of the problems. And solving it is not as easy as you think. From the behavioral literature, I'm just going to choose one example to talk about that affects tea. And that's information overload, where you get credit card application used to be a page, and that grew up to 30 pages. Or if you're online, you're supposed to check a box saying you read all the stuff. Right? You can go and read it if you want. And then it's very hard to change it once you find the things that you don't like. So, information overload is a problem. What's the solution? Well, one solution that's in the literature regularly is using heuristics. You use a rule of thumb. The rule of thumb that I want to discuss is price is an indicator of quality. Now, I'm going quite a ways back to a textbook that Scott Baines wrote, I think in 1974 or 5 or 6 in there. And in there, he discusses it. And then you have a lot of countries being studied where what they do is they take something, let's take an example of a light bulb, and you have, let's say, 8 brands of light bulbs in Japan, let's say. And you take the price of the light bulbs and you assess the quality in the lab. So this is a test that's being done by a consumer testing agency. And you rank the quality from lowest to highest. Then you look at the prices to see whether they follow. And the lowest price one is the lowest quality one, and the highest price one is the highest quality. So if you're using the rule, price is an indicator of quality, then there should be a correlation of 0.9 or something pretty high. But in the paper, I quote 15 major studies of 15 countries that over the last 60 years, they've all found that price is a poor signal of quality. For nearly a quarter of all products and services, more than 2,000 tests, the correlation between price and quality is negative. Well, that's interesting. Some of these products are really simple. Like I like to use a windshield washer antifreeze. If you have a cold windshield and you squirt water on it when you want to wash it, and it's cold, but then the windshield washer will get all smeared with ice, little film of ice will come on the windshield. The windshield washer antifreeze is very simple. It just has some glycol in it, ethylene glycol, and that changes the freezing point. There's no other characteristics. It's really simple, not complicated like a car or something. And that's one you can test. And it turns out that the more money you spend, the lower the quality is. In other words, it fails to work at temperatures near zero. So what you should be doing is buying the cheap one, which keeps it working to temperatures well below zero. So that's a very simple example. Well, anyway, for Japan, Yamada and Ackerman found that the average was negative 0.6. For Germany in 2004, correlation was 1.3. It's almost zero. I mean, that's really what you should be saying here. For Austria in 2010 was 0.30. So the low correlation coefficient means that that rule doesn't work. Price is an indicator of quality, doesn't work. Now, way back then, consumer research was already on top of that. They studied some of the other heuristics and found that some that aren't too bad. Like buying the top of the line, you buy the most expensive version of Lexus, and in general that will give you a higher quality than buying the bottom of the line. So some of them work, but this one is a big failure. Okay, how do we solve the information overload? Well, one is you do have to have those kind of tests. Secondly, what about crowdsourcing and digital share? You get ratings from people who actually consumed it. And that's really valuable information. And so it works fine, it's fine. But now we find that a market has arisen. It's a market for deception, a market for noise. And so now there are some firms that will plant the misinformation on about how good your restaurant is or whatever this thing's being tested is. it's a way to create noise that makes the T more difficult or more complex. Or you could put another term and multiply it by the T if you want. Well, Canada is one of the countries that's gone for a law against astroturfing. This is what we're talking about. AstroTurf is the false grass that people use for sports stadiums. So you put down some AstroTurf instead of grass. It doesn't wear over the so astroturfing is a term that's used to talk about doctoring the crowdsourced ratings, where you put in some false ones, so you have a firm do it for you. And Canada passed a law against it, and we just got our first conviction for well over $1 million from a big telephone company. That was one of our biggest that was doing it. There are other problems with kind of crowdsourced things, and one of it has to do with phantom websites. The Consumers Federation of America looked at 25 websites to see if they could really find the lowest price for insurance. And what they found was that 10 of the 25 sites were just disguised sites for a single insurance firm. So they always recommend their own product. They don't get the lowest price out of that. So these phantom websites are a problem. In the end, they could find that 7 of the 25 sites gave you the right answer, the lowest price. So that your chance of success using the web sourcing was 0.28, 7 out of 25. It's not very good. So what do you do to simplify T? I'm going to skip over some things that are in the paper. I did a study for the OECD after the worldwide crisis to examine market conduct variables that were contributing to the selling defective insurances. And it's one of the market misconduct things. In the U.S., they're not supposed to get a license if they've got a criminal record for important crime. But some of the applicants for licenses before the crisis were people who were in jail or on probation for fraud with banks. So they're given licenses out. So out of the 14, my argument is that most of them, or many of them, can be fixed fairly easily. And it's easier to make that fix than it is to change the denominator with the literacy. So skipping over that just to save some time here. And I want to mention one experience that Canada had. Canada got a lot of praise for not going deep into the banking crisis. And so people examine Canada and say, why is it that the Canadian banks going to fail and that sort of thing. And of course, almost everybody, like the finance minister or the people who run deposit insurance, everybody said it's us. We did it. And so success has all these claimed fathers or something. I want to explain two to you because I think they'd be especially interesting. One that hasn't received any attention, I'd be surprised if more than a couple of people in the room knew about it, is the way that mortgage insurance works in Canada is, I think, pretty sensible from an insurance point of view. There's a government backing of the first 80% of the mortgage. So there's a government institution that backs the 80%. If you don't put down the 20% that's required for a deposit, you can buy insurance. So you can move from 80% mortgage to 85%, but the 5% is going to cost you an insurance premium. You can go to 90, the premium is going to be higher, you see. So I don't see that discussed in any places, but it seems to me that that was a pretty good check on some of the things that went on in the U.S. market where people got mortgages for more than the value of the house. And so this at least protects you when the value of the housing market was down by 20%. So that's one thing. And the second thing is an institution that's got some attention, the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada. And I tried to discuss what I saw happening and how it came into force. It's a bit of luck, but the credit really goes to the Minister of Finance, who put a hard drive on trying to get the Consumer Protection Agency enforced. So we had a national inquiry, and I participated in that and surveyed all the other countries for best practices and that sort of thing. And what we found was that some of the examples in Canada practice were truly horrible. The bank documents, for example, required in many cases grade 17 to understand it. Okay, what's grade 17? Some kind of post-university. And insurance documents required grade 20. Almost nobody could understand, and you have to be a lawyer to understand the documents. So that was really, really a big failure. There are other problems that were identified. Okay, so the Minister of Finance was going to create the agency. He shopped it around. Look, should we put it in with the deposit insurance people? Should we put it in with the supervisor of insurance? And luckily, I would say, and I think there's a lesson in this, put it up as an independent organization so that the only mission of the Financial Consumer Institute of Canada is consumer protection. It's not sort of kind of parallel to some other duty they have. And I want to give you some evidence that shows that it actually did work. Now this was established in 2001, which is 10 years before the US got its board, and it's well in advance of the worldwide crisis. And one of the best, most convincing evidence of the success of the agency comes from the financial institutions themselves. Private sector polling firm is asking them a lot of questions, and I won't even pick on one of them here. But they were asked, one of the questions was, have you made changes to policies and procedures as a result of the Financial Consumer Institute of Canada's existence? And in 2004, I'm sure the year here, 2004, 2005, only been in existence from 2001. 73% of the institutions were able to say yes, and we made changes. And a lot of them had to do with simple things like documents that you could now read. So that was one study. Now, 2014, the study was done again, surveyed the institutions, and 89% of the institutions in 2014 were able to say, yeah, we made changes in our policies as a result of the existence of that agency. So my argument would be that, yeah, it helped a lot because we got some of the really obnoxious practices that were so exploited in the US. You see, with liar loans and all the things that have been mentioned already today, didn't happen in Canada. Now, we're a bit lucky, it's not on the paper, I don't think, but some of the worst company I think would be Countrywide. It's a company in the US whose business was wholly based on fraudulent packaging of mortgage-backed securities, getting them rated, or I would say misrated, by the rating agencies as being good packages when they were garbage. And Countrywide and AmeriQuest were two companies that were making a fortune in the US with bad market conduct. And they were lobbying the Canadian government, both the provincial governments and the federal government, to get the Canadian law changed, to get rid of that 80% requirement. They wanted the government, I kid you not, to guarantee 100% of the mortgage. In other words, the taxpayer is going to be on the hook for any mortgages that default for 100%. And that lobbying was going on, had a little bit of success in a couple of provinces, but the crisis happened in time. So once the crisis happened, there was a new Minister of Finance then, you could see the writing on the wall. I pulled the plug on all that lobbying, and there wasn't going to be any change to the 80%. So in a way, if the crisis had been delayed 5 years, we probably would have changed our laws as a result of the